I'm starting.
Yeah.
That's what you'll need.
And there's some when it's like interest my time and part of their life.
I need this back.
They told me to come on. And make it so correct that way, you won't be able to get it off. I mean, it'll just, so she said, yeah, she said, so you
My memory's so bad.
How kind of I am. I'm gonna come home to, is my ceiling gonna be caved in? I know, I don't even wanna go home, I can't handle my just because I'm serious. The house stinks, the house stinks. And so you have the he's been really, and he knows it every night. He keeps me away from it. You know, he didn't do anything. He's tried, but he's not going to fix it. So I guess before I left yesterday, I missed a lot of it. You know what I mean? I don't remember. And if I normally remember what I mean, but it had to be me because who else would have been there? And would have been. Yeah, and that's the upper level. And so the entire bedroom, because if the toilet runs, I stop. It's not a running toilet. Our toilet runs all day long. That's why I shouldn't even because imagine if you're toilet overflows, it's not just going to keep adding it. It's just going to be what comes out. If this keeps coming because our toilet is closed and it runs all day long. Anyway, so it's the biggest mess. And we came in. And the minute I was like, what's this water on the floor? And I'm like, it didn't spill anything. And then we it is literally, you know, so we have the kitchen, so part of it is the brown table, so they chandeliers, and water is pouring on the chandeliers. Which is really scary because that's like, and the entire it's everywhere. So we're like, oh my god, and we ran upstairs. Yeah, and then everybody does that. Even like me. He's such a blamer. I mean, I think he's a little house.
Thanks, well.
You know, I'm like, I don't remember because I really.
You want a spot?
And that's all I did. I don't remember. Well, he said it's not going to be covered for anything that's because, you know, that's what he said, but this is what I said, is that he wasn't even
Yeah, I've been.
We're about to get started. They said it should.
Well, we were gonna wait till you guys.
Well, actually, the first I heard
We'll probably start the live stream.
And we don't have to do
Are you guys
anything.
using a PowerPoint on it?
He's using a PowerPoint.
I think that was that's the background of his computer.
Is it really why I'm finding the license? I don't know. It doesn't
That's what it was. I would have rather had
And I have friends who take that would be me out on this issue or all the way to how are you?
He said it was like a.
Oh, okay.
And you know what? We were tired. The next year I did more snow because of her name, and I think that's great.
Oh, okay. Okay. I will do that. And forgive me for not knowing about your lives, but I'm so so you buddies just have to work Oh no, and you can, but you know, you want to have a graph. You know, Democrats are not hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you for your name.
So I feel like this year.
Because I never. Hi everyone. Welcome. I am Vickie Riddle with the Homeless Services Coalition in Kansas City. We are an organizational structure that runs the community. And so this conference this year is in the middle of which is our funding cycle. So not. Dan will do much better. Dan Emanuel is my co-presenter. He is from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And what we're going to be talking about today is, in fact, housing myths and myths about people who need housing and homelessness myths in general. Before we get started, I do want to introduce a special guest in our midst today, Judy Baker, who's Missouri legislature with Oxford, and who is currently running to Homeless Services Coalition. We are at the HUD grantee in Kansas City. And housing is terribly important for all of us. It's a cycle of poverty that not only cripples our nation, but so one of the things, I know that you all are, I know I'm preaching to the choir. I doubt that we have anybody here who believes the myth about people who are homeless and people who need housing. But I would like to start, because some of the ways we counter those myths is by naming them and getting them out there. So I'd like to start by having some of you, just if, you know, any of you that want to, what are some of the myths about those who are homeless that you hear in your community? Will power. Drugs and alcohol.
They like living on the street. Yeah.
Yeah, they just love being homeless.
Well, they're homeless, you know.
Really ill. I know I heard some more.
Family issues.
Family issues, okay. Any other myths that you hear about people who are quote unquote homeless?
They're men.
They're men.
Yeah.
Single men. What do those single men have in common, most of them, according to the myths?
They're alcoholics.
Alcoholics.
They're alcoholics, drug and alcohol, and what else?
Mental health, vets.
Veterans. That a lot of them are veterans, and those vets don't want to work because they thought it was such a swell deal during time of war to do drugs. What else do we know?
Criminals.
Criminal, excellent. A history of incarceration. Anything else you want to get up there before we start talking about these people?
Say no money.
Huh?
No money? They just don't have any money. They're poor.
Okay. And what else don't they have? Jobs. They don't have jobs. The homeless don't have jobs. Dangerous.
I want to add one more. It's going to be in the LGBT topic, but they was dissolved by family.
So that's that family issue that they the homeless have that puts them on the street because of a choice. That was something that you know, no willpower was sort of it. Yeah, they make a choice that causes them to be homeless.
I don't know how to say this, but there's.
Now, I don't believe that, Faye. You can anything you want.
I'm struggling with this. The people who are living in hotels and couch surfing are not homeless.
Oh, that's a lovely one. Yeah. Well, I'll just put couch surfing because we are going to talk about it. So some of these things.
I got one. I'm not sure how can I put this, but also the immigration status.
Oh, they're all immigrants. They're undocumented because I will not use the I word.
Thank you.
I'm originally from Los Angeles. When I moved to the Midwest, and I thought, what is wrong? It felt like the Stepford Wives to me. And it was because everybody spoke English, and I grew up in LA, and not everybody speaks English. And I didn't like it that they didn't speak other languages. Undocumented. Okay? Now, just as you said that, I thought of one other thing that I think is real important. It's too bad I can't think of it now. Anybody have anything else? I'll eventually think of it. So anybody have anything else?
Somebody said no education.
No education, right? Well, but uneducated. Oh. Okay. So the thing I wanted to, this isn't what I thought of, but I will eventually. Oh, I know what it is. What racial group did these people come from? People of color.
Right, brown and black people.
They're people of color. Now, first of all, I've been a social worker for a long time, 25, 30 years, I can't remember. And I no longer say majority and minority population either, because the fact is that I am not the majority population. People who represent Latinos, Hispanics, Africa, and other places, people of color are the majority. I am not the majority. So I think this issue of people of color is really important because we paint the homeless, those without housing, as this group of people. Now, what I want to talk about first are numbers, because as the continuum of care, we are required, there are 8 continuum of care in the state of Missouri. Anybody else work for one of them? Oh, yay. So they will validate that we have to count those people who are homeless on the last Wednesday of January over in a 24-hour period over into Thursday. So when we do that, we find out a lot of different things. And much of what we find out is in direct opposition to this. And I'm not making it up, we have numbers. Now, the numbers may not be perfect in any continuum of care because it's almost impossible to count the homeless 100% in a 2-day period. But we've been doing it for 20 years, and our numbers prove with the point-in-time count that, in fact, we know who is homeless and we know what their need is. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the point-in-time count, because Kansas City is a city of 469,000 people, okay? In our community, in 2015, we did the count in 2015. Oops, where's the other page? That must be it. In 2015, we had a total of 1,446 homeless people in Kansas City, Jackson County. I meant to use my phone calculator during this talk to find out what percentage that is of 469,000, but I didn't. But somebody will tell me, because somebody will be able to do it quickly. In Kansas City, we have 469,000 people, and 1,446 are homeless. Teeny tiny percentage of people are homeless. And of those people, almost half of them are women and children. We have in Kansas City 606 female adults and 840, well, no, we have 606 women and 840 men. But of those men, 17% of those men are children. So really and truly, yes, Walt?
It's 0.003. That's 3,000%.
Vickie, are you suspicious that you're not getting anywhere near the full count?
No, I'm not suspicious that we're not getting anywhere near the full count, because we do the count in 2 ways. We actually go out into the community to all of the places that the police and other agencies have told us about, and we look for people on the street starting at 6 in the morning and ending at 10:30 at night. And in addition to that, we use the HUD definition of homelessness. The HUD definition of homelessness is anybody who is not living in a fixed place of habitation that is fit for human life. So to get our number, we count all of the people who are in shelter, transitional housing, or just entering permanent supported housing. Of our 1,446, we find less than 200 people on the street.
From place to place to place in these hotels.
Nope.
And then they run out of, can't pay, then they move, because I know there's a whole cadre of folks doing that.
In Kansas City, there are about 200 people who do that, and they do not qualify as homeless under the HUD definition because they are we do count those people who are paid for by an agency, but we can't pay for it on their own. And of that 200 people, more than half of them are being paid for by an agency. So that means we have about another 100 people in addition to the it was 240 people on the street. And you have a copy of our point in time, and you can go through it. It's really long, but you can find the numbers I'm referencing. So my point about this is that in no community is homelessness an insurmountable problem. And that's the biggest public policy myth that we face. I would like to ask my colleagues who are with Continuum of Care, I don't know where you are, but I mean, our numbers are the numbers for a city of 469,000 people. Are you all in the same Continuum of Care? What are you?
St. Charles, Lincoln, and Warren County.
Okay.
So the population, you were 469, we're 369,000. Actually, that's just St. Charles County. So it's your number when we go all three counties.
Mm-hmm.
Our count last year was around 896. I don't remember exactly the number right now. That's down, so it's been trending down just for the last year or two. And I know that the city of St. Louis, and maybe somebody's from there, but their population is 300, less than that 369, so I don't know if it's 318 or 320 something. And their count has been around 1,300 people.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
Anyway.
So comparable numbers. I mean, do I think that we have every homeless person? Heck no. But our comparable numbers across the 8 COCs have remained steady and have been going down, and I will talk about why in a moment. But we don't think that we are in any way missing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And the reason we don't is because when you go out and do the point in time count the way we do, what is called the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Assessment Tool, VI-SPDAT, when you do that, with everybody you encounter, you find that many people who beg are not homeless. And that is a huge myth in every community, that everybody who says, I'm homeless. Most people who beg as a regular form of employment are not homeless. Now, that doesn't mean that they live in, $3,000 a month apartments. I don't mean that. But we have a very famous, and he's made himself famous, and he's been interviewed in the Star 1 million times. His first name is Jerry. He is the most verbal beggar that we have. And he lives in a house with his wife and 2 children, his 2 adult children. Now, I don't have a lot of money. They don't. He has some mental health problems. He also has gained a following. He's kind of a folk hero. Every community has these people. So not every homeless person is a beggar. Some homeless people are beggars. Dan is with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. There's also an organization called the National Alliance to End Homelessness. They do a lot of work nationally about homeless numbers. They have documentation over the past 15 to 20 years that about 7 to 10% of the people in any community that are homeless are residually homeless and have impairments that make them honestly believe that living on the street is better. But they are not sufficient in numbers to create the homeless problems we have. We have 1,446, so 10% is 100. We find, 244 people on the street. So what I wanted to talk about first was some of the numbers, and those are some of our numbers. Now, what are the reasons that you think what are some of the things you hear about? Well, you've already said them. we'll look at them. Family issues are sometimes cited. No willpower, lazy, they love the streets. This is 7 to 10%. And we are not going to easily get those people housed. But if we can house 90% of our 1446, then we can put a lot more resources into helping these people face multiple challenges actually get off the street. So the point in time count, the things that we learn in the point in time count are terribly important. 17% of the people that we see in our point in time count are youth. 17%. Now, HUD defines youth as under 24, and this is in specific response to a lot of national advocacy that's been done, because what is the largest? Yes.
Well, I was wondering, of those, do you know how many of them are LGBT youth? Or do you look at that as an indicator?
We try, but as you can imagine, if you are homeless and on the street and alienated from your family, that's not something people want to tell you about. But we are looking more and more at it, and it's gaining more acceptance. We have growing numbers of service providers that are working with LGBT youth that are on the street or couch surfing, and we are trying to get those statistics. But of those 17%, how many of them became homeless discharged from foster care? 90%. So we have systems issues that create homelessness, and we have to have system responses. And I'm going to talk about some of the systems responses, but what I'm talking about right now is who is homeless. And the homeless are homeless. 1446, what percentage of them have a job for more than 10 hours a week? 70%. 70% of the people who are identified as either on the street or in a post-street program, emergency shelter, temporary shelter, access to permanent supportive housing. 70% of those people have a job of some sort. Now, many of them do not get paid on the books, but not many of them are entrepreneurs. They are doing things like cleaning office buildings. They are sweeping the streets for people who hire them off the street to do that. And we have a lot of homeless women who do daycare. So most of the myths about homelessness can be disproven with your point in time count. People of color, we have more non-people of color who are homeless than we do who are people of color. Our number of there it is. We have a total of 769 people who define themselves as white and 562 people who are African American or of multiple races. None of the myths about homelessness are true, with very few exceptions. However, they are the things that affect public policy, because the myths about homelessness are what make people, including legislators, say lazy, don't deserve help, long-term, every year aren't the same. However, it isn't the same people. Every year we get 10 to 15 to 20, depending on the recession indicators. Up to 20% of the people that are homeless during the point in time count were not homeless the year before. Now, why do you think people become homeless? Because they're lazy, because they have no willpower, because they use drugs and alcohol, because they love living on the streets, because they're mentally ill? No. What is the #1 cause of homelessness in terms of, well, 30% of the homelessness in our community, measured at 400 and some people. Guess what the main thing is?
They can't afford housing.
That's number 3. That's number 4. Domestic violence. Domestic violence is responsible for 30% of the homelessness in our community. Now, how is domestic violence?
Vickie, is that to say that domestic violence, but they have money? Or they were victims of domestic violence and they don't have?
They are victims of domestic violence, and because they are leaving their domestic violence, they no longer have resources. Yeah. So homeless persons are not lazy, they're not black, they're not Hispanic, they are all of us. Almost half of the homeless are women and children. So when you are looking to make a difference in your community, there are several things that you can do. And one of the most important things you can do is to use your point in time count data wherever you are. What continuum are you ladies from? I forgot to ask.
Mention the balance state.
Oh, the balance of state. State of Missouri has 114 counties, is that right? There are 8 continuum of care. 7 of us are geographic specific. St. Charles plus 2 other counties, St. Joe plus 3 other counties, Kansas City, Jackson County, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Columbia, and Springfield, or no, Joplin. But the other counties, there are only about 30 counties in the 7 geographic specific areas. There are 104 or 100 and almost 100, I don't know, in balance of state. And so when you are doing the things that Dan is going to talk about, you need to use your point in time data because it will not betray you. Our statistics, we provide them to all of our legislators on the Kansas City side. And in the past 7 years, our numbers have gone down dramatically. Now I'll talk a little bit gone down dramatically in a few minutes. But the beginning of this is to help you identify, and I know that you know this, but these myths do not go away just because we know they're untrue. It's been proven time and time again that a lie takes at least 10 to 17 months to be diminished, and that the proving of the lie being wrong, the statistical lie that people use in politics, doesn't change the public perception. Or sometimes even people who are given the information, politicians, bureaucrats, others. Faith.
I just thought of another myth, and I think it's important, that the homeless are in urban areas.
Oh, absolutely. And forgive me for not knowing that. The balance of state proves that. The homeless are not only in urban areas. There are homeless throughout the state of Missouri, and our balance of state continua demonstrates that. And there is where they have homes, you know, Springfield, Columbia, Jeff City. It's not that the homeless are all in the cities. That's absolutely not true. So my first message to you is we can never, no matter what we're doing in this work, we can never ignore these myths. We know they're not true, but we have to repeatedly confront these myths in our communities if we're going to make any changes. And the statistics have been collected for the point in time count for the past 15 or so years, starting with right after after HUD started sending money into communities to use on behalf of homelessness. So you need to find out what your numbers are, because you have to repeatedly challenge people about those. So with that, I'm going to let Dan talk for a while.
Vickie,
yeah.
I don't know if this is a myth or true, but what I'm told in St. Louis is that that more people coming to St. Louis from places like St. Charles.
There is absolutely no documentation that proves that the homeless are mobile enough to move from place to place. And if you compare access to benefits, which are crummy in Missouri, and if you, oh, they're taping this, okay. If you compare access to benefits from community to community in Missouri, no community stands out as having exquisite benefits. And there's no documentation. There have been a lot of studies, and there are national studies. National Alliance on Homelessness is a great resource. National Low-Income Housing Coalition is another great resource. You can get documentation about the fact that the homeless do not go from community to community because the benefits don't change for the most part within a state, and smaller affluent communities are sometimes more hostile to people with a great need than the larger communities. Yes, sir?
I said a lot of those myths, but what percentage of that board would be true? As far as the lady don't want to work with drugs, what percentage would be true with that?
7 to 10% may in fact, I never think lazy is it. I never think no will is it. I think, do you have enough mental health challenges and enough family isolation that you end up believing you're better off on the street?
One quick thing, and it's a whole chapter by itself, is mental health. It used to be in that field. 10, 15 years ago, there was a sea change part of mental health. They decided to close the institutions. Deinstitutionalization was the word of the day.
Started in the 60s.
And the bottom line that meant everybody there was going to be on the street.
Right.
Because the money did not follow the patient.
That's right, and that was the problem with deinstitutionalization.
That's
The
why
money
you
did
have
not
mental
follow.
health as a,
Right.
because that image came out there, and we've never gotten rid of it.
But even mental health is not the largest reason people become homeless. The largest reason people become homeless, we never even got to number one, medical crisis that forces them to use all their resources and then not be able to pay their rent or their mortgage. At the end, we'll have more questions. So, Dan.
Okay, so I'm Dan Emanuel. I work at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So what I want to kind of do here is I want to first ask everybody a question. So just raise your hand. How many of you consider yourselves homeless advocates? Okay, it's most of the room. How about housing advocates? Or affordable housing advocates? Good, okay. So what I want to talk a little bit about is I want to kind of draw the connection between homelessness and homeless policy and what's happening with affordable housing policy, right? And we can kind of start off this whole discussion. I always like to do this. I always like to give everybody a very quick primer on housing policy terminology, just to make sure we're all on the same page, right? So when we talk about affordable housing, that means something very specific. It means that a household is paying 30% or less of their income on rent and utilities, right? There's another very important term and concept in general that we have to keep in mind, and that's this concept of cost burden, right? So your cost burden, if you're paying more than 30%, and you're severely cost burden if you're paying more than 50% of your total income. So when you're paying that much of your income, it severely limits exactly, your ability to pay for everything else, right? Like many of you probably experienced during the poverty simulation today, right? So that's why we care about cost burden. So another important concept, just this whole idea of area median income. And that's a HUD statistic that's used to calibrate income eligibility requirements. And it's done very specific geographically. So like earlier today, we were talking about the federal poverty guideline and how that kind of, maybe that number doesn't make sense everywhere. It's one big federal number. AMI is actually calibrated to the specific geographies. So it kind of takes into account the cost of living, what things cost in that given area, including rent, right? So another extremely important definition that everybody that does housing or homeless advocacy needs to always remember is this term extremely low income, right? And that means a household is earning less than 30% of the area median income in a given area, right? That includes homeless people or people who are like really seriously at risk of homelessness. And in most of the country, that's significantly lower than the federal poverty line. VLI is another important term, and that means you're earning less than 50% of the area median income. So we talked a little bit about these PIT count numbers, right? I have some other numbers I want to show you that are, let's skip over that for now. I want to talk a little bit about housing need, housing affordability in Missouri, because I think that is the primary driver of homelessness. It's the lack of affordable housing. So in Missouri, right, we just talked about how many homeless people there are, right? There are also 193,470 ELI renter households in Missouri, right? 89% of those people are paying more than 30% of their income on rent, and 74% of them are paying more than half of their income on rent, right? They are severely cost burdened, right? On top of that, there is a shortage of units, right, in Missouri of 127,833. That's how many units we're short that are affordable and available to people with extremely low incomes, which includes people who are homeless, right? Another way of putting that is what we call the gap, right? So there are only 34 affordable and available units for every 100 ELI households in Missouri. So, the difference there is, exactly the shortage, the gap. So, what's happening in Missouri it's not an isolated problem. It is part of a very large national housing policy problem we're having, right? And that is, you can see that there are 10.2 million ELI renter households across the United States, and 75% of those households are severely cost burdened, which means they're having a really hard time just after paying rent, affording basic things like transportation, healthcare, food, saving up for college, building assets, being able to afford buying your own home. You get the idea, right? And there is a total amount of affordable available units for these households of 7.1 million. Huge problem, right? And here's the gap statistic again. There are only 31 affordable and available units for every 100 ELI households in the United States, right? So why do we have this shortage, right? Well, there's a market failure happening here. It costs more money to build housing that's affordable to an ELI household than you can make renting it out, right? It's just not profitable for the private market on its own to come in and build that housing. So it doesn't do it, right? So you have 7.1 million unit shortage, right? That's pretty significant pent up demand. The market would have figured out a way to meet that demand and turn that into a profit by now if they were able to do it on their own. So another issue that we have is inadequate funding. So earlier, I think Dr. Provetti was talking about, how many people were helped by housing subsidies to come out of poverty. And it was a fairly low number. And that's because unlike SNAP or SSI, it's not an entitlement, right? So just because you qualify for affordable housing, right, doesn't mean you get it. Only 1 in 4 people in the US who qualify for housing assistance actually get it, because we just don't dedicate the resources to it, right? It is not an entitlement. The other big issue, which I'm going to touch again on later in the presentation, is that the major subsidies we do have lack deep income targeting or even any kind of income targeting whatsoever, right? A good example of this, and this is a great, but low-income housing tax credit actually requires a layering of subsidies in order to create units that are affordable to extremely low-income households. So very often that means combining a voucher on top of the LIHTC subsidy, because the low-income housing tax credit is actually targeted at about 60% of the area, which is twice, ELI, which is 30%, right? And then the mortgage interest deduction. That's a housing set with 0 income target, right? I'll get back to that one. So what I want to say is that there is a direct connection between your PIT count, right? The fact that there are homeless people in Missouri, and the lack of affordable housing for extremely low-income households in Missouri and the United States in general, right? And that homelessness is tied into broader issues regarding the alignment of federal housing subsidies. So homelessness is a subset of housing poverty, which is a subset of just policy. So if you're a homeless advocate, you need to be also paying attention to everything that's happening in the broader housing policy environment. We're going to get into a bit of that later. So, Vickie?
So Dan is talking about things that are connected to the way in which we deal with this problem. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are the things that we can do in our communities that set the stage for the kinds of things Dan is talking about. And one of the most important things for those of us who work in the social science field, whether we're social workers or not, if you're trying to help people, you know that we need data. And data is the way to change people's mind. And so there are some best practices that have developed in the past 15 years, slowly and with gaining strength around the issue of how to help the homeless. And I want to talk about some best practice issues that are absolutely your community to engage in if we are going to get a handle on actually figuring out what helps people who are homeless. What do you suppose the main thing is for helping a homeless person? Give them a place to live. And for the homeless, we do not place that as the most important factor. What do we tell homeless people who come to our agencies or our communities and say they need housing?
Stop drinking.
Stop drinking, go to a shelter, get a job, yeah. We tell people they have to be housing ready, and yet none of us are housing ready. My very first apartment in Los Angeles cost 40% of my first job out of college. I wish I had it now, and I wish I'd never left it because, you know, hopefully it would make me a millionaire. What we know is that when we tell people they have to be housing ready, we're setting them up for failure. We have to look at housing as the primary resource to help those who are homeless. We don't get to tell them they have to be housing ready because none of us, in essence, are perfectly housing ready. Who had perfect credit when they went to an employer and asked for a raise? Not me. So we have to stop telling people they have to be housing ready. And we have to acknowledge that we have statistical data that proves housing is the best way to get people off the street, out of homelessness on a sustainable basis. One of the ways we can do that is something that is really hot right now for HUD. It's called coordinated assessment. Anybody know what it is? Anybody hear about it? A few people do. Coordinated assessment is when we're going to look at everybody's need in a way that defines everybody that says they're homeless or at risk of homelessness. We are going to look at their situation, and we're going to get people into housing, not based on how long they've been on a waiting list or how long they've been diagnosed or how long they've been anything else. We're just going to look at their immediate need for housing. And what this comes down to in terms of coordinated assessment is we're going to look at who's going to die first if they stay on the street. Because what do we do for a person with an appendicitis? We take their appendicitis out. We don't tell them they shouldn't have eaten fatty foods to get an appendicitis. I mean, nothing we do around the issue of homelessness makes any sense if you try to compare it to other things that we do in the community. So the first thing we need to do, and I've got a bunch of handouts for you, the first thing we're going to talk about is coordinated assessment. And we do coordinated assessment using our United, not necessarily perfect. I'm not saying that our system is perfect, but we have developed a questionnaire that I'm going to give to you. And when somebody calls the United Way, which is 211 in our community and in many communities, or there may be something similar in smaller communities that come together around the issue of homelessness, we use a specific coordinated assessment document that is based on that VI-SPDAP, the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Assessment Tool. The reason we use it is because it's been proven over the past 15 years to be very effective. So we've created a questionnaire that when you call the United Way 211 line, we call it our coordinated assessment line. Some people still call it the hotline. We're trying to get them to stop doing that because I don't like that. So they say, what is your need? And they say housing. Well, what do most people mean when they say housing? They're not sure. They may mean that they're about to be evicted. They may mean that they're on the street, or they may mean that they don't catch up their water bill. They're going to be evicted. So we do coordinated assessment, and the first thing we use is this form that I'm going to give you, and it's a decision tree. It determines if you need immediate shelter because you're on the street, if you need prevention, or if you need diversion. And what do you think? Out of every 100 people that calls the United Way in Kansas City, and well, it's a 9-county metro area. What do you think the percentage of that 100 people that call and say they need housing right now? What do you think the percentage is that are actually on the street?
25.
Some months it's been 25, some months it's been 17. We have a very inaccurate way of serving homelessness because homelessness implies you have no fixed residence. And we force people to become homeless before we help them because we don't have resources for diversion. And a lot of what Dan is talking about creates diversion and prevention. So one of the things every community, and you represent a variety of communities, every community needs to do coordinated assessment so that they can accurately reflect how many people that need housing are actually homeless. Now the next thing every community needs to do is to use the VI-SPDAP. This is a national tool that was developed by, unfortunately, for me, being a current Kansas City resident, a Canadian. I don't know if he's a Toronto fan or not, but he might as well. This form was developed by a Canadian named Ian DeYoung. And Ian has a lot of experience running agencies and organizations that serve the homeless. The VI SPDAT identifies people's vulnerability to death, decreased health, or other kind of danger by remaining on the street. And when you combine the VI SPDAT, which includes the questions we ask in the assessment form to identify prevention, diversion, or actual shelter, when you use the VI SPDAT, you identify those people that are the most in jeopardy of either dying on the street or suffering irreparable harm. The VI SPDAT allows every community that uses it to define effectively who's homeless, whether they're at risk of homelessness or actually homeless, who's in need of prevention, who's in need of diversion, and who's in need of shelter. Now, why would this be important? Knowing the difference between those three things: shelter, diversion, prevention.
Knowing where to put your money.
Yeah, better than knowing where to put your money, because which is the most expensive of those? Shelter. Yeah. Diversion and prevention, dependent upon, and you know, there are lots of statistics in the stuff I'm going to give you that you can look at. Diversion and prevention usually costs anywhere between 10% to 40% of the cost of shelter. So we are not, by saying that this problem is insoluble, we are contributing to a tremendous drain on our economy. So using coordinated assessment through one or even 2 or 3 locations that identify the homeless, that will help you know real numbers of what people need. Because most of the time when people call the United Way or other agencies and say, I'm homeless, they're not. They are just desperately afraid of becoming homeless. Some of them are homeless, and they need those critical resources that are most expensive. There's another section of the VI SPDAT that allows you to create a resource that is incredibly important, and that is a by name registry of who in your community is homeless. On our by name registry, we have 190 people listed. Now, not all on the street, I'm not saying they are, but they are desperately in need of housing that is sustainable at their income level. So by creating a by name registry, you take away people's ability to say to you, it's an insoluble problem, we don't have enough money. We do have enough money. Using the resources we have cut down on the number of homeless vets by half in our community. Now, why vets? Because there's been a big emphasis on getting vets off the street, because it's humiliating for our country to have veterans from as far back as the Korean War, or even a few who are 97 and, you know, World War II. It is humiliating for our country to admit that people who serve their country are living on the street because we don't allocate resources effectively. So, coordinated assessment, using the VI SPDAT, having a by name, those are 3 things your community can do. Here's another thing. We have models that work. And I was asking earlier, what do people who are homeless need or at risk of homelessness? They need housing. And if you use the Housing First model for utilizing your housing, if you don't require people to take a test before they get their housing, if you put people in housing and then you surround them with supportive services, which are always less expensive than than shelters cost, you will in fact get better results. So there are a lot of best practices we can all engage in that will solidify our ability to support the numbers Dan is talking about and help us move public policy. Because as a social service provider, I don't know how many of you work in direct service, how many of you work in administration. I learned a long time ago that no matter what I did with a client, no matter how healthy they could be, if the environmental is pernicious and vile and hostile, nothing changes for those consumers. You can send all the kids you want to Head Start, which is a marvelous thing to do, and then if they go into a school that rejects them because they came from a Head Start program, they're still going to fail. And that is our big failing. we have to change the environment. And the way you change the environment is with proof. So Housing First is a model, and you're going to have a copy of it, of a Housing First model. Wraparound services. We have to stop saying that there is one solution to any systemic problem. The problem in our country is not homelessness. The problem in our country is not limited to homelessness, to joblessness, to a lack of affordable housing. The problem in our country is systemic poverty and courage as a nation, because we want to blame people. We want to go right back to the 16th century and say, if you're homeless, it's your fault because of any number of these things. If you can't afford your rent, it's because you don't have a good enough job. Well, maybe you don't have a good enough job because you went to school in a large community, of which there are several in Missouri, where the education is pathetic and most high school graduates cannot read beyond the 3rd grade level. You cannot isolate people based on race, ethnicity, gender orientation, and then say to them, oh, now you be a fully productive citizen. That's not possible. So the idea of having wraparound services that help people bridge those gaps once they get housing, and not help them for 30 days or 60 days, but help them for a reasonable amount of time. There's lots of social work research that's available anywhere you want to look. If someone has never had a full-time job, it takes them at least 3.5 years to get to the point where they can understand and embrace the intrinsic value of work. You don't have to raise your hand. How many people here think they get paid enough for what they do? None of us. Because we're not at an insurance company, and we're not at IBM or any place, or God forbid, Google. None of us necessarily gets paid enough for what we do. But we ask people with no job history and homelessness in their background to take a job that's hard, menial. Sometimes it's hard to get to because, you know, we've shipped a lot of our entry-level jobs away. We ask people to take that job, and if they've never worked in their 22 or 30 years, to cleave to that first job that we help them get in a way that transition to a better job. Unrealistic. We have to stop being unrealistic about what we ask people, even with some of these problems, to do. And then just the last thing I'm going to mention is we all have public housing authorities in our communities. Public housing authorities, for the most part, are funded at 85% of the budget that they had the last year they were in the black, whether that was 2 years ago or 20 years ago. The Public Housing Authority of Kansas City is funded at about 82% of what their basic salary costs are for the work they're currently doing. That doesn't provide for a very effective system. We want public housing authorities to target units for homeless persons, but at the same time, they have to target people in many areas based on length of time on a waiting list. Now, HUD has said that's unacceptable, but HUD hasn't done anything about it. So targeted public housing authority set-asides are really important for all the things that Dan's going to talk about now. My big thing is, this is a problem of systemic poverty. These are all symptoms. All of these things are symptoms in many ways of deep poverty. Some of them can be isolated only to mental health, but that's a very small percentage. And if we could get 90% of the people off our streets that are homeless without significant mental health issues, we would be in a far better position to help those chronic resistant individuals who are going to need much more than housing and wraparound services. So, and all of my stuff is coming in a big handout to you. So that would put you to sleep while we talk. So
Just a quick question. What is the FDAC?
VI-FDAC, vulnerability, it's vulnerability service prioritization assessment tool. And there's an organization, I know it's stupid, but that's what, you know, first it was called the Vulnerability Index, the VI, and then when it got all sophisticated, it had to have all those other letters. Ian DeYoung, I DAIN, Diong, little d, little e, JONG, org.code is his organization. You're going to get what we developed off of his stuff in my handout, but you can find him all over the internet. And it works, and he has documentation. In fact, HUD is now using his data and his statistical analysis to promote the use of the VI-SPDAT. So we need to get on board. That's all there is. Damn. Oh, I forgot. Anybody who needs social work CEUs, there's a thing up here. Pass it around, just pass it all the way around, and then afterwards you can come to me and I'll give you a thing. Okay, next.
So I just want to very quickly, before I get to this next thing, I want to make a point of clarification. I completely agree with Vickie that systemic poverty is the driving factor behind homelessness. So when I say the lack of affordable housing is the primary cause of homelessness, it's because I think that regardless of someone's situation, right, they should have a right to housing. I think housing should be an entitlement. So when we think about somebody that's, for example, coming out of that domestic violence situation we just talked about, I think that person should be able to have shelter. They should be able to have housing, right? And I think I completely agree with everything Vickie was saying.
But on that same point, in terms of the gap you pointed out, where you can have income, low-income housing available.
Right.
There's still no place for you to go.
Yes, exactly. So that kind of transitions to what I want to talk about next, which is this whole idea of going further upstream, right, in terms of housing policy. So, back in 2014, I was at the Housing First Partners Conference in Chicago. Did any of you guys go to that? It was pretty interesting. So that was all about housing first, right, which Vickie just really did a great job of discussing with you all. And at the very end of that conference, so the whole conference was very much about best practices in housing first and VSPAT and all that stuff, right? And at the very end, in the plenary session, Samson Barris, who's like the godfather of Housing First, and then Nan Broman, who's the president of the National Alliance Against Homelessness, they're having a discussion on the stage, right? And that discussion was about, the discussion was about, the conference, next steps, and that kind of thing. And then somebody in the audience asked, well, in our community, we just don't have the money to do this stuff that we want to do, right? So I want to talk a little bit. I feel like we're kind of at that point right now in this conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about where we can get that money, right? But I think a lot of people right now maybe feel like, well, that's not going to happen. All I hear about every year are like budget cuts, right? Cutting this, sequestration, right? And we keep hearing, well, the government can't afford these programs, right? That's not true. Okay, we can afford to address homelessness and housing poverty in this country, right? The gap that I discussed about, the problem of chronic homelessness, all of that can be addressed, right? And possibly altogether ended, right? It's really just a matter of how we prioritize our funding and how we target subsidies. So when I'm about to look at, Vickie was talking about the VSPAT and prioritizing housing subsidies at the local level. I want to talk about doing that at the federal level in a sense. So one really important way we can go about doing that is through tax reform. So, and through, for example, through reforming certain tax expenditures, right? So a tax expenditure, for anybody that doesn't know, is basically a loophole in the tax code, right? And it's essentially spending by another one. So at the federal level, in 2016, it's projected that tax expenditures, all of them, all the ones we have in the tax code, are going to cost, as a tax expenditure, $1.31 trillion, right? So a lot of that cost, some of that is EITC, tax credit. They're good programs in there, but not everything necessarily is, is effective or targeted at what we're interested in, right? So that brings me to this whole idea of the mortgage interest deduction, which is our second largest tax expenditure.
So to make that a little more clear, you might say that's taxes that could be collected but are not because they get.
Exactly, it's
tax-free.
lost revenue, right? Which is the same thing as collecting the money and then spending it.
What's the first?
I'm blanking on that, something. It's second though. So the MID is for anybody that doesn't know, it's a federal tax expenditure that allows certain mortgage holders, right, to deduct the cost of the interest that they pay on their mortgage from their individual federal income taxes, right? Is everybody familiar with that? It's a very, very popular program. So another thing to know about this deduction is that mortgages up to $1 million are eligible for this benefit.
How many people have $1 million mortgage in the room?
I have a good statistic on that, just a second. So, in 2016, the Joint Committee on Taxation of the Congress projected that MID will cost us in lost revenue, essentially, as you pointed out, a total of $81.6 billion. Right? What was the total FY15 HUD budget that was enacted for it was 45.3. We're talking, we spend almost twice as much on this tax expenditure as we do on the entirety of the HUD budget. So that's all the vouchers, that's the public housing, it's all the programs that we in this room care about for addressing homelessness and housing poverty. It's expensive. Especially about who benefits from the mortgage interest deduction. One of the biggest myths is that it is primarily a middle-class benefit. Okay. There are some people, particularly at the National Association of Realtors. I read an article on there recently where somebody was claiming that MID is actually a safety net program. Okay. And that's going to seem really ridiculous in a second. So here are the facts about who benefits. Only 21% of tax returns claim the MID in 2014. The top 61% of those folks, the people who are earning more than $100,000 a year, received 82% of the total benefit. And the top 18%, people with incomes greater than $200,000, received a whopping 42% of that benefit. So MID is really targeted at higher income people, right? It is not a middle class benefit, really, certainly not a safety net program. It's deeply, deeply regressive and arguably very wasteful. We need to reform MID. There's actually bipartisan support to do this, right? And Bipartisan Policy Center, Kit Bond is actually part of the Housing Commission for that, right? They came out and said, we should think about reforming MID. It's not our proposal, but they've suggested that we should probably think about doing that, right? So what I want to talk about now is our United for Homes campaign, and that's centered on our proposal for reform of the MID. And that reform consists of two simple changes, very modest, simple changes to the mortgage interest deduction. The first is that we're suggesting that we should limit tax benefits to interest paid on the first $500,000 of a mortgage. So I mentioned that there was a really good stat about Missouri. Here it is. 1.2% of all mortgages in Missouri between 2012 and 2014 were over $500,000, right? And the other thing to realize about this is we're just saying we're limiting it to the first $500,000 for mortgage. Even if you have $1 million mortgage, you're still getting tax benefit under our proposal, right? Just on the first $500,000. The second part of our proposal is that we want to change MID from a tax deduction to a flat 15% non-refundable tax credit. That does something really important because currently MID is a deduction, which means you have to be able to itemize on your taxes. In order for it to make sense for you to itemize on your taxes, you have to earn enough money, right? So a lot of middle and lower income homeowners who are not getting any sort of tax benefit on their mortgage right now. So what happens if we implement these changes? Well, the number of homeowners with mortgages who get a tax increase from 39 to 55 million. Okay? And of these 16 million new beneficiaries, 60 million new people getting tax relief, right? 99% would have incomes under $100,000. The second part of this proposal is that by implementing those two simple changes. Yeah.
So 99% have incomes under $100,000. But in Missouri, 60% of households in the state of Missouri have income of approximately $50,000 and down. So I wonder how that affects those.
It means more of those people would likely be eligible for tax benefits under mortgage, in all likelihood. So the big thing, right? The other thing that these two simple changes would result in is approximately $230 billion over the next 10 years. Our campaign is proposing we invest that in something called the National Housing Trust Fund. Does anybody here know what that is? Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. So for those of you who don't know, right, it's a new federal program that we've worked very hard to implement. It took a 15-year campaign, thousands of advocates across the country, right? And next year is actually going to start receiving funding. And what the trust fund does is it's a federal program for building and rehabbing extremely low-income primarily rental housing, right? So that's the housing our clients need. And then here's some final takeaways I wanted to leave you all with. Homelessness and housing poverty are inextricably linked with the larger housing policy landscape, as we saw with the mortgage interest deduction, right? And it's also true regarding housing finance reform. The trust fund is tied up in all of that. So if you care about homelessness and housing poverty, you have to think about this bigger landscape, right? Housing finance. And again, I think everybody already knows this in here, you can't be a homeless advocate without being a housing advocate, and vice versa. Now we have the resources to deal with the issues that our clients are facing. It's a matter of priorities. And the final point I want to leave you with is I really hope every one of you will have your organization endorse the United for Homes campaign. And I'll hand out some materials about the campaign. I have some housing need for data for Missouri I'll share with you all, and some whole FAQ on the NHTF and that kind of thing. And Vickie, any thoughts?
Well, we both got handouts for you. Walt's going to help us distribute the evaluation. We've got tickets for you to win stuff if you give us your evaluation. We want to entertain questions. We have about 15, 20 minutes to do that.
I have a question for Dan.
Sure.
Is there any, I got tons of stuff, but I'll take a little small portion of this time. Is there anything like talks with HUD? Some years ago, HUD kind of humored us and they wrote a letter to the like the Department of Corrections and said, hey, we should help this population. This is a population that needs this type of housing. No enforcement came, no one ever did anything, no more than Sean wrote that, Donovan wrote that nice letter. Is there anything that's going to happen? And then number two, is there any reform for public housing authorities? And I don't suggest you kick people out, but I suggest that people need to be held to, I'm trying to put it really nicely, so that it can meet the needs as needs, so that we're not always housing history and back. There are generations who have been in public housing and Section 8 housing. Is there any reform that we can meet today's needs? We have more people that are releasing from mass incarceration, and so people need this type of housing.
So I was literally talking about that with my colleague before I came down here, because apparently the federal government is about to release 6,000 former, I believe they were drug offenders.
That's correct.
Yeah. So we're talking about this campaign with the whole the criminal justice reform community right now. We're starting to do that. So I think those conversations are happening. They're going to be happening, and I think part of that is also making sure that there are fewer barriers. We have to make sure there aren't barriers to entry into things like public housing, Section 8, right? And they're not being discriminated against for
There is all kind of evidence that they are. In fact, the federal government only has very few restrictions for public housing. but many local housing
Right.
authorities have imposed additional restrictions, which almost ensure that anyone with any kind of history of incarceration is not going to.
More importantly, not only you don't even have to have a history of incarceration. If you have a relative who has a history of incarceration, and anybody finds out they spent a night in your public housing unit,
You're kicked out.
you're kicked out. What I wanted to say about your particular question is that there's something called, I mean, this workshop, we could have both talked for 2 days. There's something called the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. It is the administration's attempt. It's been in existence now for like 9 years. Get all these different agencies to talk together. Is there a specific piece of legislation? Not this year. There won't be legislation. There will be no comprehensive legislation until the 2016 election. Nobody's going to go out on a limb before then. Is that fair? No. Is it just? No. Does it suck? Yes. But keep forgetting about that thing. But the fact is that we can't wait for the perfect time to make our demands heard, and heard loudly, around the mortgage income deduction, the Housing First model, specifically free program, and that's one of the HUD requirements in the continuum of care this year. Most of our agencies, we have 22 agencies plus 7 new projects in 3 agencies that all have to say they're housing first if they want to be funded. And so even though people don't come roaring, you want to do housing first, it's getting better in terms of HUD requiring some things that do reduce barriers. But no, there's no legislation right now, but we're hoping.
And there's another way to address that is through, administrative advocacy and trying to get HUD to issue further guidance on something like that, which nonprofits can do to their heart's content, because that doesn't count against your lobbying requirements or anything like that, or limitations.
One question about the mortgage interest deduction. If you have more than one home, you can take that on however many homes you own, or you only get to do it once. Yeah, you only get to do it on one.
I think I forget the exact details, but I think you can take some of it off of a second property at a vacation home or something like that. Yes.
As Empowered Missouri endorsed United.
Of course. Yes.
Oh, and I would be killed if I didn't say this. Empower Missouri has an affordable housing and homelessness task force that I co-chair with Nicole McKay from the Salvation Army in St. Louis, and we beg you all to come. Our next meeting is December 8th, I do believe. It's on the website.
I missed, but can we go back to St. Louis, and maybe there are people here who could talk about this. We have a huge emergency shelter that is likely to be closed. And the statement is that because wealthy communities surrounding the city of St. Louis are not providing housing, homeless people come to the city of St. Louis because it does get federal grant money provide housing services, and so the stream of people coming into the city is unending. And if we shut Larry Rice's shelter, then that will solve the problem. So I don't know what the myths are in there or how to answer all of that.
There are lots of resources that Empower Missouri St. Louis chapter has about that. Look at the St. Louis chapter information on the myths about that.
Well, and I don't understand. I'm on the chapter board. I haven't a clue where to go to look.
Go to the website and look up our resources on issues in St. Louis.
I did. The housing task.
No, the St. Louis chapter task force, or the St. Louis chapter. But at any rate, see us later about that, because that's not
okay. Okay.
There you go.
Network. Right, there are ways that Empower Missouri can help.
So any other questions? Well, we hope we were somewhat useful and helpful. And there you go. You're free. My handouts are all up. there. And many things were passing them around. I left them up there because I thought it would be easier, but whatever. I put mine over there.
Drawings, we put our names on, dating